Northern Powerhouse Rail is basically a lie. I mean, it's got absolutely no chance of happening in practice. It is bound to either never get started or to end up like HS2, i.e. get started, go wrong, and then get chopped by the Treasury. And the North would end up getting little or nothing from it.
Welcome to Calling All Stations, the transport podcast. I'm Christian Walmer, an author and journalist who has covered transport for the past 30 years. In every episode, we try to keep you up to date with the most engaging news stories, policy developments, and interviews in the transport world. And I'm delighted to be presenting the first episode in Series 4. And with me is my regular co-presenter, Mark Walker, who has spent decades looking at transport policies and legislation. So, Mark, what are we covering today?
Hello, Christian, and welcome back to you and to our listeners. There's a definite North of England flavour in our principal stories today. First of all, we'll be looking at the debates around Northern Powerhouse Rail and the publication of a new report that questions some of the current live proposals in that sphere. We'll also be examining a controversy in Yorkshire around the proposed filling in of a disused rail tunnel, which campaigners believe could be used for other forms of active travel. For more than a decade, there's been a very lively debate around developing a project which has come to be known as Northern Powerhouse Rail, which would seek to link more efficiently by rail the principal cities of Northern England, notably Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, and possibly as far across as Hull on the East Coast. Before the recent Labour Party conference, it was suggested that the government was going to back the Northern Powerhouse Rail scheme, but no announcement was forthcoming. And in the intervening time, a new paper has been published which expresses some scepticism about the project. This is called Instead of High-Speed Rail, Northern Transport Schemes That Will Work. And it's been written by Andrew Gilligan, who was formerly Boris Johnson's transport advisor during Mr. Johnson's time as Prime Minister. It was published by Policy Exchange, which is a right-of-centre think tank. Christian has been to meet Andrew to discuss his findings.
I'm with Andrew Gilligan, who has written a pamphlet about Northern Powerhouse Rail and how he sees it as a mistake on a par with HS2, which, of course, he campaigned against both in government and out of government, and as a long-time opponent of it, as actually have I. But his latest pamphlet is quite specific about really how not to spend good money after bad. And I thought I would catch up with him. And first of all, Andrew, let's say, what exactly is the argument in your pamphlet?
So my argument is not that the North doesn't need better railways. It desperately needs better railways. But that Northern Powerhouse Rail is just an incredibly bad way of delivering those railways.
Well, what is Northern Powerhouse Rail? I found it difficult to find out.
So what it's widely reported as, one of the interesting things we found, actually, we did some polling on this in government when I was transport advisor to the PM, and we found that most people in the North didn't know what it was. They thought it was just general improvements to the North Rail services, which they and I totally support.
And me too.
But actually, the core of Northern Powerhouse Rail is a new build high-speed line between Liverpool and Leeds via Manchester. And yes, there would be some parts of it used to include things for Sheffield and Hull and things as well. Maybe some of the trains would go off the new build high-speed line.
But it's high-speed line all the way through.
High-speed line.
Starting with the section between Manchester and Liverpool.
Yeah. And that's the basic proposal. And some of it was originally going to be shared with the northern leg of HS2. About the last 15 miles into Manchester from Liverpool, from a place called Millington near Manchester Airport into central Manchester. That section was going to be jointly shared with HS2. So that's the basic proposal. And what we understood from briefings over the summer is that the government was going to make some kind of commitment to at least the Liverpool-Manchester element of that line.
Yes, there's been lots of noises off. There's been kind of obviously briefings to newspapers about this, and even a sort of semi-announcement. Or we're going to do Liverpool to Manchester. Yes.
So the case I make in this pamphlet for Policy Exchange, where I work now, is that this is an absolutely insane way of delivering better services in the north, and even between Liverpool and Manchester, because obviously the basic problem, Liverpool is almost exactly west of Manchester, but this new line would first go 8 to 10 miles out of Manchester in the wrong direction, roughly south. Only then would it turn west towards Liverpool, and as a result, the journey from Manchester to Liverpool would actually be longer on this multi-billion-pound high-speed line. It would be longer than it is now.
Do we know where it would start? It starts on the Liverpool South station.
Well, part. Yeah. So broadly, what the current plan on the table is appears to be kind of like new build high speed line south out of Manchester, under in an 8-9 mile long tunnel under the suburbs of southern Manchester, down to somewhere near Manchester Airport, and then a bit more high speed line onto Warrington, and then it joins what's called the Fiddler's Ferry line, which is an existing conventional freight line, not used at the moment, but still there, to Ditton, near Liverpool, which is where the main line from London to Liverpool comes in at the moment. And then it looks, I think the plan is to follow that to use that conventional main line into Liverpool. Although actually, in the document the mayors of Greater Manchester and Liverpool City Region have put out demanding it, that section is shown as dotted lines. So I think they might also want a new build underground line, a new build station in Liverpool.
So what's there not to like, apart from the fact that it's going to cost a lot of money?
It's an extraordinarily bad way of even just serving that journey. So the official rationale of going 8-9 miles in the wrong direction, south rather than west, is that you serve Manchester Airport. But actually, the Northern Powerhouse Rail station at Manchester Airport wouldn't be at the airport. It would be about a mile away from the airport, on the other side of the M56 at Davenport Green. You'd have to get a bus or a tram to the airport. So journeys to the airport would actually be slower, or at least no faster, than they are under the current conventional service, which goes right into the heart of the central terminal area. So it's a truly insane way of even serving Liverpool-Manchester. And more broadly, I mean, look, public transport is a network, and the way you improve public transport is you improve the whole network. You basically, you need to make it easier for people in thousands of places to travel easily door to door, often by connecting from a train or a tram to the bus. Improving public transport does not mean grafting one or two new high-speed lines.
This is a point thing, isn't it? Yeah. So it wouldn't have many intermediate stops. It would be a high-speed line.
So what they're doing, the whole approach at the moment has been called by somebody else actually, Ian Ray, who's the Professor Emeritus at the Heseltine Institute at Liverpool University, coiner of the Northern Arc concept. He put it better than I could. He calls it projects without a plan. What it is dropping these isolated high-speed rail schemes, serving a handful of places on what are still otherwise a decrepit network. And that is a deep mistake. It's terribly expensive, and it won't help the vast majority of people.
So how's this come about? How have they kind of messed it up to that extent? Is it because they were building HS2 and then they've abandoned that?
I think, so the official reason they're building it the wrong way is to serve the airport. But like I say, it won't go anywhere near the airport. You'll go a mile away from the airport. Right. So the real reason, I'm sure, is that bit in the wrong direction was originally slated to be shared with HS2. Yeah. The HS2 southern bit, the HS2 bit to the Midlands. HS2 phase 2A. It was cancelled in 2023.
What's not to like about that, apart from the fact that it's going to cost a lot of money?
It's an extremely expensive and inefficient way of solving the North's transport problems. It won't solve them mostly. So the main problem of the North Railways, the main capacity problem is not on links, i.e. kind of lines between cities, between places. It's at nodes. It's where the trains all converge. overwhelmingly on central Manchester and central Leeds. And Northern Powerhouse Rail, obviously it would help to some extent, but not very much for an enormous amount of money. HS2 would help to some extent, but not very much for an enormous amount of money as well. So there's 59 trains an hour to, from and through Manchester Piccadilly Station. HS2 would take 6 of those trains out of the station. Northern Powerhouse Rail maybe another 7 to 10. So you create capacity of about 25% for billions of pounds, tens of billions of pounds. There are much better ways.
So what would your alternative be? Because you've suggested a crossrail, but that would equally be expensive.
So it would be expensive, but it wouldn't be anything like as expensive as a new high-speed line. So, Northern Powerhouse Rail, just the Leeds to Manchester section alone, we costed at £36 billion in the integrated rail plan in 2021. That's 2021 prices. It would be 45 or so now. The Manchester Liverpool section, the mayors are claiming 17 million. I think that's another estimate.
Billion.
Yeah. So it's going to be more like 30, I should think. So we're talking probably 75 billion for the Liverpool Leeds Northern Powerhouse Rail full high speed line. And bluntly, that's too much money. And a crossrail across Manchester would do more to solve the problems, and it would cost perhaps a fifth as much, maybe a quarter as much, and it's actually deliverable. My other worry about Northern Powerhouse Rail is basically a lie. It's got absolutely no chance of happening in practice. It is bound to either never get started or to end up like HS2, i.e. get started, go wrong, and then get chopped by the Treasury. And the North would end up getting little or nothing from it.
But politically, Labour has to do something for the North.
Yeah, that's right. That's what I'm saying. I think, like I said at the beginning, I absolutely think the North's rail network needs massive improvement. But a couple of isolated high-speed lines plonked down on is not the way to deliver that improvement.
But are you you've always been against HS2. Isn't this just your prejudice against HS2?
I'm not against all high speed. I supported HS1, for instance. It was a sensible scheme. It was delivered relatively effectively. It connects to a big continental network. You've got the distances at which high-speed rail works. Because that's the other problem with high speed in the north and in England generally. It's a small place. The distances between stops in the north particularly aren't great enough to allow the trains to reach high speed. So the maximum distance on Northern Powerhouse Rail between Manchester and Bradford would be about 30 miles, just over 30 miles. That's not long enough for a high-speed train.
Well, Hull to Liverpool is 150 miles.
Yeah, but obviously, but you've got stops in between, haven't you?
Quite a lot of stops, yes.
Yeah. So, and on the Liverpool-Manchester section, you'd have 3 intermediate stops in about 40 miles, and so you'd be building a high-speed line on which trains would never be able to reach high speeds. High-speed works high-speed works best at distances between about 300 and 500 miles. That's when you can start making significant difference in journey times. And Britain hasn't got many of those distances. Obviously, all England's main cities, apart from Newcastle, are all within 200 miles of all the others, or less.
But you were responsible for advising Rishi Sunak at the time that he cut what was probably the more useful part of HS2, which was the link between Handsacre Junction, Birmingham and Crewe. Do you think that was justifiable?
I kind of think, look, if you're in a hole, stop digging. Don't throw good money after bad. Because doing phase 2 would have been an extra 40 to 50 billion pounds. And can we seriously say that should be the country's highest capital spending priority at a time when, local transport is crumbling, public services of all sorts are in trouble, we need new homes, new reservoirs, new sewage treatment plants, new spending on defence. And like I say, I even if you believe that the West Coast Main Line is full, which I don't, even if you believe that a new high-speed line is the only way to tackle that, which I don't, can you honestly say that it should be the country's number one infrastructure priority? It shouldn't. Not even the number one infrastructure priority in transport. The number one infrastructure priority in transport is to improve the often dreadful local and regional services around our biggest cities in the north and the Midlands. That's what drives growth.
Better buses, better buses, better suburban trains. Yeah.
What Transport for London has done in London. We forget that 20, 30 years ago, the London transport system although more heavily used than most regional transport systems, was also in a great deal of trouble. And significant and sustained investment on a planned and network basis, that's what you need. So you lots of little things. You need contactless ticketing, better buses, more bus lanes, upgraded conventional lines, new stations. That's what you need. You do hundreds of little projects, not one or two big iconic schemes dropped down on a still decrepit system.
Okay, well, what about the West Coast Main Line? Because you may dispute the fact that it's full, but it is pretty crowded, and it certainly could do with some relief.
I agree with that, and although you look at the numbers and you see there's like 27,000 seats a day between Manchester and London, of which about 9,000 are filled. So it doesn't support, to my mind, the contentions being made that the West Coast is going to be full in a few years. Also, a lot of trains on the West Coast are extremely short. Like 80% of the trains from Birmingham to Manchester only have 3 or 4 standard class carriages. That could be fixed quite quickly without needing to do any infrastructure works at all. But I think there is a need for some infrastructure works, but more modest ones that would be deliverable and provide benefits more quickly. So things like flyovers at College, new line at Shugborough, new lines at Crewe, that kind of thing, to fix the pinch points that restrict the capacity of the line.
Your pamphlet hasn't exactly gone down well with what you see as the HS2 Taliban, and it certainly had some criticism. So how do you answer that?
Yeah, some people in government seem to be taking some kind of notice of it, because clearly there was going to be an announcement. It's been delayed. I know lots of people in government have the same doubts I have about these schemes. But yeah, broadly, the industry, the reaction of the industry is a little bit depressing. Some of it was just basic ad hominems, which is silly. And a lot of it didn't really try and engage with the actual arguments.
But I'm not sure it's a great idea putting Richard Tice of Reform as the introduction, because I think the pamphlet was actually rather better and more informed than that. But anyway, that's your decision.
But look, the content of the pamphlet is what we should be talking about here, not who wrote the introduction. And I don't think an awful lot of the criticism that it's had from other people in the rail industry really address the central concerns. And I remember there was another podcast that said, they were saying things like, you can't, it should. They were trying to sort of say it would be easier to build an entire new 80-mile high-speed line from the Midlands to Manchester than to just put a few flyovers in at College and some extra tracking at Shugborough. And I just think it can't be, can it? I mean, the last major one of those we had, the dive under at Warrington, cost £200 million. That wouldn't buy you a single mile of HS2 track. It'd buy you about half a mile, if that, of HS2 track. And I think one of your colleagues at Rail wrote something that said something like, it's a mistake to say that the Leeds mass transit can take services out of Leeds station, one of the other northern pinch points, because the first line they're planning isn't on a rail route. Well, and that my response to that was simply that just demonstrates the tragic lack of joined up thinking in British transport policy. How can it possibly be right for the people planning the West Yorkshire mass transit system to do it in a way that's completely isolated from the rest of the rail network, not to consider the benefits it could bring to the rest of the rail network? Because clearly that Leeds is the second most important pinch point in the north. The answer to that is to take quite a lot of the local services that currently pass through Leeds station out off the heavy rail tracks through the station and onto the mass transit system. The mass transit system should be designed to allow that, which is exactly what would happen in any Swiss, German,
I was just going to say,
French,
German,
the whole thing would be
yes.
planned holistically.
Right.
And instead what they're doing is they're planning it in almost complete isolation of the rail network. They're going to do a line that parallels the existing line from Leeds to Bradford along a kind of tram-like route. And I just think, you idiots, what are you talking? What are you doing? And why does nobody think in a joined-up way in this country?
Yes, I was taken with something you said, actually, which you said that Northern Powerhouse is a bit of a lie. By which I understand you mean, well, there's not going to be the money for that.
Look, there's no hope of the money. If we can't even find the money to finish off the Midland Main Line electrification, if there's even doubts now about the full electrification of TRU, the Trans-Pennine Route upgrade, there's some talk that they might not fund the electrification of Stalybridge to Huddersfield. And if we can't even for certain find the money for those things, where on earth are we going to find £70 billion for a whole new line? And I just think, look, even if it actually happened, even if the Northern Powerhouse as originally planned actually happened, the vast majority of people in the north would not benefit greatly. It would only serve a handful of stops. But the blunt fact is, it will never happen. It can never happen. It'll go the same way as HS2. It'll end up in the same mess, worse mess actually, because it's even less mature than HS2 was when it was given the go-ahead. Like literally, it's a line on a map. Not even a line on a map in places. It's a dotted line on the map at the Liverpool end, and there's simply no prospect of it being delivered to the time and the budget specified. Just as with HS2, and we're seeing exactly the same. Absurd claims about how much and little it will cost, and exactly the same absurd claims about how many billions of pounds of economic benefit it will deliver. And we'll end up, if we go down that road, we'll end up in exactly the same places with HS2. We'll end up massively inflated costs, the Treasury pulling the plug, and a national embarrassment, and most people getting nothing.
So if you were back in number 10 now, you would be advising them to what?
I would advise them not to give Northern Powerhouse Rail another thought. I would fund the Elizabeth line of the North, because that is relatively cheap and deliverable, but it would be tremendously effective, far more useful than HS2 or Northern Powerhouse Rail. I would embark on a mass programme of electrification across the north of England, maybe electrifying 80% of lines. And again, that's relatively cheap. You could do that for about £9 billion. Even based on the cost of the most expensive and dysfunctional recent electrification, GWR, it would cost about £9 million.
It's now costing less than that as well. Yes.
Yeah, it's cost. I mean, we would hope to do it for less, because with a continuous program, you'd have the supply chain efficiencies that could bring the cost down, like Scotland has done. And so
the West Coast Main Line,
the West Coast Main Line, I do flyovers at College. I do some extra tracks at Shugborough. I do some stuff at Crewe, and bluntly, I'd run longer trains on Birmingham, Manchester than 3 or 4 standard class carriages, and some of those other things you could do straight away. So there are other things you can do straight away. You can run longer trains more widely. Half the trains leaving Leeds in the evening rush hour have only 2 or 3 carriages. Hardly any train in the north. No train in the north, apart from the ones to London and a handful of the ones to Birmingham, cross-country ones. No train in the north, apart from those, has more than 6 carriages. That's ludicrous. Virtually every train in the southeast has...
Well, Thameslink has 12.
Yeah, Thameslink has 12. Every Elizabeth line train has 9. 80-90% of the trains leaving Waterloo in the evening rush hour have more than 8 carriages. And again, that's a relatively quick and easy way. It's not completely easy, of course. You'd have to lengthen some platforms, you need some power upgrades, but it's a hell of a lot easier and quicker and cheaper than building a whole new line. So look, part of the problem in the Boris Johnson government was cakeism, and I argued very strongly against it and lost quite a lot of these arguments. This idea that you can have high-speed rail and all the other good things you need as well, like local transport, trams, bus lanes, the rest of it. Well, look, at high-speed rail prices, you just can't. You have to choose, or at least you have to prioritise. You have to sequence. You have to do the local stuff first, the important stuff first, and only then do you go for the comparative luxury item of high-speed rail, which is in fact what France and Germany and Spain actually did do.
What you mean? They actually built a lot of municipal trams and all that sort of thing.
So France upgraded its local services before. So they started the RER, for instance, in the 1970s in the Paris area. The first TGVs didn't open until the early 80s. So they got it in the right order. Germany ditto. And the key strengths, the key weakness of Britain is the weakness of its regional economy, and that's not because it's because the cities individually are weak. And what you find so the argument made for high-speed rail is that it will agglomerate the whole of the north into this big region like the Rhine-Ruhr or something. Well, actually, if you look at the Rhine-Ruhr, you find that it doesn't operate as an agglomerated region. Each individual city has its own economy.
You point that out in the pamphlet.
Indeed.
Yes.
But the difference with the north is that the cities are individually strong, whereas in the north the cities are individually weak. And agglomeration and economic growth takes place within city areas, not between them. So when I say a city area, I mean like Greater Manchester. So it's not just Manchester itself, but it's the towns and countryside immediately around. But I do not think that there's any prospect of a single high-speed railway line creating a kind of wholly agglomerated north. because you don't see that in the Rhine Royal, you don't see that in the Randstad, you don't really see it in any part of.
I suppose in some ways, I mean, I've always argued that you want a network southeast for the north.
That's exactly what you want. You're always hearing anti-Burnham people saying, we want what the south has. Well, what the south has is a dense, frequent, but low and medium speed web of railways, mostly electrified, high frequencies. That's what the north needs and should get, and that's what my ideas would deliver. Whereas if you do high-speed rail, bluntly, that will take all the money for everything else, and you'd be very lucky even to hang on to the services you've already got, let alone improve them.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Andrew. That's great to hear that argument, and I'm sure there'll be some people who disagree with you. But thank you very much.
Well, that was fascinating, Christian. What are your main takeaways from your discussion with Andrew?
Well, I think it was fascinating. Particularly the timing was very interesting because clearly, deliberately, Policy Exchange published it just before Labour Party conference. And the fact that then this announcement, which you mentioned in your introduction, then didn't happen, I think was not an entire coincidence. I think that actually Andrew Gilligan's arguments bore a lot of strength, and somebody probably heard them in the Department for Transport and said, gosh, let's not rush into promising this high-speed line between Liverpool and Manchester, which really will cost an awful lot of money, and lots of other things could be done instead. And Andrew Gilligan is not anti-rail by any means, just because he's been anti-HS2 for so long. He's actually very pro-rail, and he's a cyclist himself, and pro-sustainable transport. But I think he has highlighted the fact that this is the wrong scheme to go for.
I suppose in many ways the controversy, but perhaps it was deliberate controversy that was stirred up by the paper, was because the foreword was written by Richard Tice MP, one of the leading figures in the Reform UK party, and it was published just after the Reform UK party conference as well, when they were sort of riding high in all of the headlines. So Andrew's paper kind of got associated with reform, and maybe that's detracted from the seriousness with which his proposals have been taken.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I asked him about that, and he said, well, they did that deliberately to get some traction on it, and in that respect, it was successful. But I think that people who focus on commentators on the railways and politics and whatever might have dismissed it somewhat as a bit opportunistic, which I think is a shame, because I think much of the argument in the pamphlet, and I hope that people get hold of it and read it, it's available online, of course, we'll see that there's a lot of force behind that argument. And as Andrew Gilligan said, he's got a very good idea for a sort of cross rail for the north. It would be cheaper than what they're actually suggesting, and a lot more useful. So I hope that this is not dismissed, and that when the government eventually comes out with some proposals, it will take heed of them. It's worth noting that my sources in the rail industry do suggest that there really isn't any more money available. And so it's going to be very difficult for ministers to come up with something positive out of that without committing vast amounts of new money.
And actually, I think we should conclude by saying that if somebody from the campaign in favour of Northern Powerhouse Rail would like to come onto the podcast and talk to you, we'd love to hear from them. So do get in touch.
Great idea. A couple of years ago, there was a major scandal over the fact that National Highways, which oddly is responsible for a lot of former rail infrastructure, was going around infilling the space below bridges on the very spurious grounds that they presented a danger as these bridges were supposedly about to collapse. In fact, it was later shown that this was just not the case. And fortunately, a very successful movement by heritage campaigners put a stop to that. But now there's another scandal brewing over a long tunnel between Bradford and Halifax. And I went along to talk to Graeme Bickerdike, who is one of the leading lights in the campaign, about both the former issue over infilling bridges, and also the proposals about the tunnel between Bradford and Halifax. Graeme, talk to us first of all about your campaigning over the Highways Agency's attempts, or Highways England as they are now, attempts to close off these bridges. I remember kind of supporting your campaign then and writing about it, but what on earth was all that about?
They're actually national highways now. They
Oh,
were
they're
highways
national highways.
when we
Sorry,
started.
okay.
They were Highways Agency when they took on 3,000 legacy structures. And I think you mentioned English heritage. They were nothing to do with it at all.
No, Highways England, I said. Highways England. Right. Yeah.
Basically, the Highways Agency inherited 3,100 structures when British Railways Board residuary became defunct. They are the custodians. They're not actually the owners of the structures. The Secretary of State owns the structures. But National Highways maintains them on the Secretary of State's behalf. It was never a very comfortable custodian. I don't think many people thought they were the appropriate custodian. It would be better off with a railway body, but it was not possible to transfer them at that time to Network Rail because of the way Network Rail was constituted. So they ended up with National Highways, who regarded them as liabilities.
Well, even things that weren't on the roads that they controlled. They controlled all these bridges and structures that weren't anywhere near their main network of roads.
Correct, yes. Nothing to do with the strategic road network at all. They were 3,000 plus legacy railway structures that were previously British Railways Board residuaries, and then got transferred to the Secretary of State when BRB was abolished.
Right.
So they regarded these things as liabilities. I don't think initially they wanted anything to do with them, but they were lumbered with them. And because they were basically being managed by a very small group of people, sort of buried away within National Highways, nobody took a lot of notice of them. And one of their key things was to reduce liability in terms of their reputation and in terms of finance. And so what they wanted to do was demolish a lot of structures. They had an aspiration back in 2016 to demolish about 10% of the estate, 10-15% of the estate, which would be circa 300 or 400 structures.
My God.
But they were successful in filling a lot of structures. They infilled, I think, about 50 between 2013 and 2021, including some that had potential for reuse as part of greenways, cycle routes, and one or two
footpaths. Yeah,
I think there was one or two others. There was one down near sort of Midsummer Norton, which was intended for reuse as part of Heritage Railway. So this was a program of works that was detrimental to future transport use and was really prompted simply by a desire to reduce liabilities.
And largely took place out of the public eye. We didn't know much about this.
Generally speaking, no. Early on, the infilling schemes were generally subject to planning applications, but they then became quite adept at using permitted development. And there was a point where they were trying to, and indeed in the context of Great Musgrave, were successful in using emergency permitted development rights in order.
What does permitted development mean? What does that mean? Permitted development.
Basically, permitted development is a collection of rules whereby, under certain circumstances, you can develop schemes and implement schemes without having to get planning permission.
Right. Okay.
So if you are acting on behalf of the Crown, there are emergency permitted development rights that you can use in certain situations where planning permission would be going through the process of planning permission would be too protracted. You need to act now because there's an emergency, therefore there are emergency permitted development rights that you can implement. But
sounds like the sort of thing that Donald Trump has got very expert
at. You can say that. I'll sidestep that one. But yes, so they were.
So then you got wind of that. You got wind of this then, that they were filling in these things.
Back in late 2020, there was a scheme down in the southwest where there was a proposal to infill a bridge under emergency permitted development rights, which would have compromised a greenway proposal.
Right.
And those involved in that were unhappy, and a couple of the people involved thought that we really needed to be campaigning against this kind of destructive action. And I was approached to help in that campaign.
Right.
And when we looked into it, we discovered that their aspirations were to get rid of over 100 structures through infilling or demolition without there being any analysis of what the benefits of those structures were in terms of their heritage value or in terms of their repurposing potential going forward.
Right. And then you won that particular campaign, did you?
Well, we lost a few, though.
Right.
Unfortunately, we were a bit too late in terms of 3 or 4 structures that were infilled under permitted development, emergency permitted development rights, errantly. But in the case of Great Musgrave Bridge, which was the poster boy of the campaign, if you like,
the one that attracted fame.
Yeah, they infilled that bridge without any consultation with the 2 heritage railways that intended to relay the line underneath it. They didn't speak to the local highway authority. They didn't speak to the parish council.
This was where? Sorry, where is Great Musgrave precisely?
Great Musgrave is near Kirby Stephen in
Right.
Cumbria, beautiful part of the world. And there's the Eden Valley Railway based at Warcop. There's the Stainmore Railway Company based at Kirby Stephen East. And they've aspired really for 20 years now to reconnect their lines right the way up through to Appleby.
Brilliantly, they did infill it. And in an absolutely hideous way, there's this fantastic photograph, which I think you took or somebody took, of this concrete mess. And then you managed to get this reversed, haven't you?
There was a concrete mess. Yes, absolutely. They carried out the works. Actually, when they started the works, there was a local outcry, and the local planning authority approached National Highways and said, actually, we don't want you to do this. Please don't do it until we've decided whether you need planning permission. But they implemented emergency permitted development rights, which basically meant they could get on with it with or without permission.
Because they claimed that the bridge was going to collapse, didn't they?
They claimed a lot of things that were complete and utter rubbish.
Right.
Why they did that isn't really clear, because if they genuinely believed some of the things that they were claiming, then they are incompetent and shouldn't be anywhere near these kind of structures. But they were probably saying it for other reasons, that they were having to justify why they were using emergency rights when that was clearly not appropriate for them.
So despite the council telling them not to do it, they did it.
Correct. But the problem with using the emergency permitted development rights was that unless you have the permission of the local planning authority to retain whatever you've done, the default is that you have to remove it. So having gone down this road of basically telling the local planning authority to go and put their heads where the sun doesn't shine, they were then forced to apply for retrospective planning permission, which they didn't get. 911 people objected. 2 people wanted it retained for reasons best known to them. And a year later, following an enforcement notice, the infill was removed. So Great Musgrave Bridge is pretty much back in the condition that it was. It's in a little bit worse state because removing the concrete didn't do it any good. But it's now regarded as having a capacity of 137 tons, which
they
is
claimed
more than sufficient for a little rural lane.
They claimed it couldn't carry 6 tons or something, didn't they?
They claimed it had an assessed capacity of, this is testing my memory, either 17 or 18 tons.
Right.
But they were using a capacity assessment that had long since passed its sell-by date, had various problems with it, and should never really have been relied upon for decision making, but they did rely upon it. But the current capacity assessment is something like 137 tons.
This is Graham. You say this in a rather flat way, but this is a complete and utter scandal. I mean, it's just quite. I mean, I'm amazed that you can keep your cool over this. I mean, just the waste of money and the deceit and the. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a great scandal, which is why I'm very happy to get it on the podcast. So, what just before we get on to Queensbury Tunnel, what did this little exercise do you think cost them in terms of filling it and unfilling it?
Well, in terms of Great Musgrave, it cost them 124,000 ish to fill it in,
Yeah.
and I think it cost them 352,000 to uninfill it. So the taxpayer has spent about £500,000 on infilling and uninfilling Great Musgrave Bridge. There are all sorts of scandals that went on here. They effectively tried to bribe the local planning committee into granting planning permission for the retention of the infill by saying we will spend £400,000 on structures we don't own elsewhere up the Eden Valley if you grant us planning permission to keep this infill. They are scandalous. It's a scandalous organisation, is National Highways. Some of what they were doing was just breathtaking. They are better now. The government, shortly after Great Musgrave happened, the government stepped in and said, right, you're going to have to pause. We want a proper process of consultation, stakeholder engagement. That's now in place. It's a bit of a tick in the box. I'm part of a stakeholder advisory forum that advises National Highways. To what extent they actually listen,
But
I really don't
it
know.
just
But
I can't.
there is now a process. There are safeguards in place, but culturally, whether there's been any meaningful change in the outlook of National Highways in relation to these structures.
Well,
Not
I mean, that's the interesting point. I can't get my head around why they should want to bother to do this with so much effort and kind of almost viciousness, antagonism, for not very much saving very much money and angering a lot of people. It just, I mean, was there a particular person driving this, or was it? I mean, is it just maybe what you just said, the culture?
culturally, they were never suited to managing the estate. They clearly didn't want to manage the estate. They wanted to ensure that their costs and their reputation were protected. There are individuals close to this management who leave something to be desired in terms of their skills and ability, and outlook. But we are in a better place now,
Right. Okay.
um, as a
Okay.
result of the safeguards that have been put in place. But the National Highway should never been put in the position of managing these
Because it was
structures.
the wrong agency to do that. Obviously, yes.
Absolutely. They don't understand railway structures in the way that obviously people in Network Rail.
That's hardly surprising. They're the National Highways Agency. So this brings us neatly to the Queensbury Tunnel. So tell us about what the Queensbury Tunnel is and now what the plans for it are.
Well, the Queensbury Tunnel was built by the Great Northern Railway 1874 to 1878. It was one of the biggest civil engineering projects in that part of West Yorkshire. It's between Bradford to the sort of northeast and Halifax, Calderdale to the southwest. It became disused in the 50s, and its condition has declined in the years since then to a point where BRB, back in 2009, decided they wanted to abandon it. And abandon it would basically mean infill the shafts and infill the ends of the tunnel and allow the rest of it to collapse and walk away and pretend that it
Right.
never existed. The the view of the local community was that if you're going to spend a lot of money on this structure, wouldn't it be better to spend it in a way that the public derives some social and economic value going forward? And although reinstating the railway People would like to do it, but it's really not viable from a cost perspective or an engineering perspective, although West Yorkshire Combined Authority, if you look at their aspirations for a mass transit network, if there's ever a future extension into Calderdale, then their initial thought was that it would go through Queensbury Tunnel.
Right.
But the more likely option would be to repurpose it for active travel. It connects two large conurbations which are otherwise separated by a damn great big hill.
Right.
And they have, as part of this recent feasibility study, Sustrans did try and plot a route over the hill, and it's just ridiculous. It involves, 500 feet of climbing, whereas the tunnel is flat.
Right.
And so there are all sorts of reasons why Queensbury Tunnel is a strategic connector and a very valuable piece of infrastructure. And even at the exasperatingly high costs for repair identified by, yes, you guessed it, National Highways, it would still generate £3 in economic and social benefit for every pound spent on repurposing it, which is value for money.
Right.
So there's every reason to do it. But at the moment, there isn't that money to be spent. So what the Department for Transport as the owner and National Highways as the custodian want to do is to draw a line and spend a lot of money on the abandonment scheme. Now, the context for that is that back in COVID days, lockdown days, Grant Shapps, who was then Secretary of State, said, actually, abandonment is not the way to go. We want to repurpose this structure. And £7.3 million was subsequently spent strengthening the structure so that all the shafts are now permanently supported. And then they walked away at the end of 2021, having mitigated what they perceived to be the risks associated with the tunnel. But then out of the blue in July of this year, Lillian Greenwood, who at that time was Minister for the Future of Roads, but is responsible for the Historical Railways estate, announced that she was going to commit £7.5 million more of public money to complete the abandonment scheme. So we'll be, if it goes ahead, we'll be in the ridiculous situation of having spent the thick end of £15 million on Queensbury Tunnel to deliver precisely zero public value.
Okay, but so I think, I mean, quite apart from the ridiculous thing that the Minister for Roads is in charge of the tunnel, which kind of you have explained why. Presumably, they are arguing that it costs a lot more than £7.5 million to salvage this tunnel and make it usable for pedestrians and cyclists.
Back in 2016, National Highways was asked to produce a costing, and they costed it at £35 million to repair, which, allowing for inflation, is thick end of £50 million now. But Grant Shapps, when he said, right, we don't want to abandon this tunnel, put up some more money for a feasibility study. National Highways was asked to produce another figure, and that figure was somewhere about 21, 22 million pounds. So their cost had halved from 2016. But there was an engineering consultancy company called ACOM, who Bradford Council commissioned to carry out a study in 2018, and they thought that the tunnel could be repaired for 6.9 million.
Right.
If you account for inflation, you're looking at maybe 10 million, probably not that much. So for the 7.5 million they proposed to spend on abandonment, you could pretty much repair the tunnel. Maybe a little bit more. So it is very much a which way do you want to go situation. It's not a question that you would have to find huge amount more funding in order to repair the tunnel. The two are relatively comparable.
Okay, so where are we at now with the campaign? You've highlighted this, it's had some press. Are we waiting for any decisions, or is it going ahead with the closure, or what's happening?
The government have said this is the way they want to go. They want to go down the route of abandonment. They've said National Highways can have £7.5 million over 5 years to do it. So it will be done in stages. What they need is planning permission. So prior to Grant Shapps' intervention in 2020, They'd applied for planning permission, and it's not yet been determined. Hasn't that application? There have been 8,000 objections. The council hasn't determined it because it needs more information. Which
Whose decision is it? Cornwall Council, is it?
City of Bradford Metropolitan District Council.
Right. Okay.
Is where the planning application is currently lodged. So it's down to the council to approve it or not. National Highways, we understand National Highways have met the council within the past couple of months to talk about the planning application, but it's not yet gone to a committee. So we are waiting for determination of the planning application.
Okay. And so do you think this is the first of many similar such battles, or do you think that this is just a one-off?
I mean, Queensbury Tunnel is a particularly complex scheme in that it involves a big, difficult, challenging structure. I mean, there have been a couple of collapses within the tunnel, relatively small collapses, easy to remediate, but they are there.
It's about a mile long, isn't it?
It's 1.4 miles long,
right,
so
yes.
It would be by far the longest cycle tunnel.
Right.
And there's been historical flooding. Getting a route out at the south end is doable, but not as doable as we would like it to be. But you know, it's a transport asset, and lots of people can see the value in it.
It would be a tourist attraction. Hey, Britain's longest cycling tunnel. You know,
absolutely.
I mean, that would be exciting. Yeah,
absolutely.
I'll come up and visit it. You know, I'm a cyclist. You know,
we look forward to that. I mean, if you look at the Monsell Trail in the Peak District, you look at what happened in Bath with the two tunnels route. You know, these historic railway structures are honeypot attractions. They bring people to those areas and bring economic benefit with them. And you know, we're talking about an area with a certain amount of deprivation, West Bradford, North Halifax. They could do with those kind of benefits. So
absolutely. I just did a park run on the Monsell Trail a few weeks ago, a new park run that they've set up because of the Monsell Trail, and there was 400 people there on a Saturday morning in pretty much the middle of nowhere, because it's nowhere near even the local town. So, which is Crowthorne, I think it's called. And you know, that was 400 people who wouldn't be there otherwise. You know, so exactly the same sort of thing. I mean, you know, and they all went, they had cups of tea and breakfast in the local cafes and stuff, and you know, that was 400 people generated by the fact they'd opened up this trail.
You speak to the Peak District National Park Authority, they would tell you that the Monsell Trail delivers huge economic benefit to that area, and the same story in Bath, and the same story up and down the country now. If you look at Chepstow, where Tiddenham Tunnel was repurposed recently, these are all facilities that bring people into those areas, and that's what those areas need for an economic boost. Queensbury is unique because it unlike the Monsell Trail, unlike Bath, it connects big conurbations which cannot otherwise be connected for active travel. So it's not just about tourism and leisure use. It would be a reasonable, practical alternative for commuting. If you needed to commute from Halifax to Bradford, the roads are pretty awful round there. Rail service isn't great. You could get on your bike and you'd have a flat route between the two places. So Queensbury ticks all the boxes, but unfortunately we have custodians who are determined to get rid of it, as opposed to investing that public money in a way that delivers benefit. And given the situation we find ourselves in economically in this nation, to spend millions and millions of pounds on something that delivers no benefit is just breathtakingly ridiculous.
Well, Graeme, that's a fantastic way to end this. You know, every best wishes in your campaign. Certainly come back on the podcast if you have other news to tell us about it. But you know, I'll be up there as the one of the first people to cycle through it if when you win your campaign, which I'm sure you will. Thank you very much for that.
Thanks, Christian.
Here's Christian's final thought from the Departure Lounge.
Well, as somebody who cycles to stations a lot and cycles every day, in fact, I'm now going to be a bit warier of leaving my bike at railway stations, because apparently the British Transport Police have basically announced to all the thieves out there that they're not going to bother to investigate any thefts at railway stations. Even if there is CCTV showing the miscreants nicking people's bikes, they're not going to bother looking at it because they're too busy and got other things to do. And so don't bother calling us about it because you're wasting your time. And I must say, I'm totally shocked by this. I mean, I never expected that, they would investigate every theft and so on. But to make this announcement, to basically tell people that we're not going to investigate things, I mean, it's really just kind of begging people to come along with their angle grinders and nick all the bikes at all the stations. So I think they better change their tune on this one.
Calling All Stations, the Transport Podcast with Christian Walmart, is produced by Cogitamus Limited, a leading provider of public affairs consultancy services in the sector. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, please consider giving us a 5-star rating with whichever platform you use. Do follow us on social media channels, including Blue Sky, Facebook, and X, formerly known as Twitter. Our handle on X is @AllStationsPod.